In the biting wind of an afternoon, a boy walks alone to a wooden shed at the edge of the community. Inside, among tools and worn-out furniture, an injured German shepherd tries to hide. Without a word, the boy raises his hand and offers $5 to the irritated auctioneer. At the back of the shed, a man watches the gesture in silence, leaning against an iron pole. The boy walks away, pulling the limping dog across the wet yard. In the middle of the night, the German shepherd finds a hidden door under the loose dirt. For a second, no one breathes. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss a single one. Thank you for being with us. Now back to our story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden barn as folks from Millbrook gathered for what everyone knew would be the Henderson Estate auction. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her worn baseball cap and checked her watch, knowing she had exactly 2 hours before her shift at the diner started. Her 12-year-old son, Tommy, bounced beside her, his eyes wide with excitement at seeing all the accumulated treasures of a lifetime spread across makeshift tables. "Remember what I told you, Tommy," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to count every penny. "We're here to look, not to buy. We can't afford to bring home anything that doesn't put food on the table or fix what's already broken." Tommy nodded solemnly, but his attention had already wandered to the crowd of neighbors and strangers picking through rusty tools, faded furniture, and boxes of forgotten memories. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that could carry across 3 counties, stood on a makeshift platform constructed from hay bales and plywood, his gavel ready to turn a lifetime of belongings into quick cash. Old Henderson had been a fixture in Millbrook for as long as anyone could remember, living alone on the outskirts of town with only a few animals for company. Now that he'd moved to the county nursing home, everything had to go. Sarah felt a pang of sadness looking at the scattered remnants of a life lived in solitude, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had her own problems to worry about. The auction began with the usual suspects: farm tools that had seen better decades, kitchen appliances that belonged in a museum, and furniture that would need more love than most people had time to give. Tommy watched with fascination as neighbors bid against each other for items they probably didn't need, driven by some combination of nostalgia and the thrill of the hunt. "Next up, we've got this here German shepherd," the auctioneer announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Now, I'll be honest with you folks, this dog's seen better days. Got a limp, looks like he's been through some tough times, but he's still got some life left in him." Sarah's heart sank as she watched the dog being led forward on a frayed rope leash. The animal moved slowly, favoring his left rear leg, his once proud head hanging low. His coat, which should have been a rich brown and black, was matted and dulled by neglect. Most telling of all were his eyes, which seemed to hold a sadness that matched the grey clouds gathering overhead. The crowd fell silent, and Sarah could feel the collective discomfort as people shifted their weight and avoided looking directly at the suffering animal. This wasn't the kind of auction item that generated excitement or competitive bidding. This was a reminder of life's harder truths, the kind that small communities usually handled quietly, away from public scrutiny. "Now I know what you're thinking," the auctioneer continued, his voice losing some of its earlier enthusiasm. "But this here's a purebred German shepherd, and with a little care and attention, he could be a fine companion or guard dog. Who'll start the bidding at $50? The silence stretched longer than anyone felt comfortable with. Sarah watched as the dog's eyes slowly lifted to scan the crowd, as if he understood exactly what was happening and had already accepted his fate. She felt Tommy tense beside her, his small hands clenching into fists. "All right, let's try $25. The auctioneer said, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "Come on, folks, this is a good dog who just needs someone to give him a chance." Still, no hands went up. Sarah could see the calculation happening in people's minds. The cost of feeding a large dog, the veterinary bills, the time and effort required to nurse him back to health. In a community where everyone was struggling to make ends meet, taking on someone else's problems wasn't high on anyone's priority list. $10. The auctioneer tried again, his voice now carrying a note of resignation. Surely someone can spare $10 for this poor fellow. That's when Tommy's hand shot up into the air, trembling but determined. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she grabbed his wrist, trying to pull his arm down, but Tommy held firm with a strength that surprised her. "I've got $10 from the young man in the front," the auctioneer called out, his voice picking up energy again. "Do I hear 15? The crowd turned to look at Tommy, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She could see the mixture of pity and amusement in their neighbors' faces, the way they looked at her son, as if he were a naive child who didn't understand the reality of the world. "Tommy, what are you doing?" Sarah hissed, still trying to pull his arm down. "We can't afford a dog, especially not one that needs medical attention." But Tommy's gaze was fixed on the German Shepherd, who had lifted his head and was now looking directly at the boy. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire auction had stopped, as if the world had narrowed down to just a damaged dog and a boy who saw something everyone else had missed. "No other bids?" the auctioneer called out, his gavel raised. "Going once, going twice." "Mom, please," Tommy whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at him, he's just like us." Sarah followed her son's gaze and saw what he meant. The dog's posture, the way he held himself despite his obvious pain, reminded her of her own struggles to maintain dignity in the face of hardship. She thought about the stack of overdue bills on her kitchen table, the leaking roof that would need to be fixed before winter, the constant worry about making ends meet. "Sold to the young man for $10, the auctioneer announced, bringing his gavel down with finality. The crowd began to disperse, moving on to the next item, but Tommy was already walking toward the dog. Sarah watched in amazement as the German Shepherd's tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of life he'd shown since being brought forward. "I'm sorry about this," Sarah said to the auctioneer as she fumbled for her wallet. "My son, he's got a soft heart." "Nothing wrong with that, Mom," the man replied, his voice gentler now. "World could use more folks like your boy. Dog's name is Rex, by the way. Old Henderson mentioned that before he left." Sarah handed over a crumpled $10 bill, watching as Tommy knelt beside Rex and gently stroked his matted fur. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing as if he hadn't felt kindness in longer than he could remember. "Well, Rex," Tommy said softly, "I guess you're coming home with us." As they walked away from the auction, Rex limping beside them but keeping pace, Sarah felt a mixture of worry and something else she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the recognition that sometimes the most important decisions weren't made with the head, but with the heart. The drive home was quiet, with Rex lying across the back seat of their old pickup truck, his breathing steady but labored. Tommy sat beside him, one hand resting on the dog's head, already planning how he would nurse his new friend back to health. "Tommy," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence, "I want you to understand something. Taking care of Rex is going to be expensive. We're already struggling to keep the farm running, and veterinary bills aren't cheap." "I know, Mom," Tommy replied, his voice more mature than his years should have allowed. "But sometimes you have to do what's right, even if it's not easy." Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Rex watching her with those intelligent eyes, as if he understood every word of their conversation. She had the strangest feeling that bringing this dog home was going to change their lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. As they pulled into the driveway of their small farmhouse, Sarah noticed how Rex's ears perked up and his head lifted slightly, as if he was taking in every detail of his new surroundings. The property wasn't much to look at. A modest house with peeling paint, a barn that had seen better days, and fencing that needed constant repair, but it was home. "Come on, boy," Tommy said, opening the truck door and helping Rex down carefully. "Let me show you around." Sarah watched as her son led Rex toward the house, the dog's limp more pronounced now, but his spirit seeming to lift with each step. She had no idea that this $10 purchase would soon uncover secrets that had been buried for decades, or that Rex would prove to be far more than just a companion in need of care. The first few days with Rex proved to be more challenging than Tommy had anticipated, though he never let his mother see his doubts. Each morning before school, he would check on the German Shepherd, who had claimed a corner of the old barn as his temporary home. Sarah had insisted that Rex stay outside until they could determine if he had any diseases or behavioral problems, a practical decision that Tommy reluctantly accepted. Rex ate sparingly from the bowl of kibble Tommy had bought with his allowance money, his appetite seeming to match his cautious approach to everything else. The dog would watch Tommy's every movement with those intelligent brown eyes, as if trying to understand whether this kindness was real or just another disappointment waiting to happen. "He's been hurt before," Tommy explained to his friend Jake Morrison during lunch at school. "You can tell by the way he flinches when you move too fast, or how he won't let you touch his left side." Jake, whose family owned the feed store in town, shook his head with the wisdom of someone who'd grown up around animals. "My dad says some dogs never get over being mistreated. Says they carry it with them forever, like a scar you can't see." But Tommy refused to accept that Rex was beyond help. Every afternoon after school, he would sit with the dog in the barn, talking softly about his day, his dreams, and sometimes about his father, who had left when Tommy was 7. Sarah had never spoken much about why his father had gone, only that some people weren't meant to stay in one place for very long. "The thing is, Rex," Tommy said one particularly grey afternoon, "I think you understand more than people give you credit for. I think you're just waiting to see if we're going to stick around." As if responding to his words, Rex lifted his head and looked directly at Tommy, his tail giving the slightest wag. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a victory. Sarah had been watching these interactions from the kitchen window, her heart torn between practical concerns and pride in her son's compassion. The veterinary bill alone would set them back. At least $200, money they simply didn't have. But seeing Tommy's dedication to the wounded animal reminded her of the boy's father, who had also possessed an unshakable belief in lost causes. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, nearly a week after the auction. Tommy was in the barn reading to Rex from one of his adventure novels when he heard his mother's voice calling from the house, sharp with alarm. "Tommy, come here, quickly!" He found Sarah standing in the backyard, staring at a section of their property line, where the old fence met the woods. Rex had somehow escaped from the barn and was digging frantically at the base of a large oak tree, his injured leg forgotten in his urgency. "Rex, no!" Tommy called out, running toward the dog. "Come here, boy." But Rex ignored the command, something he'd never done before. His paws were working furiously, sending dirt flying as he carved out a growing hole beneath the tree's exposed roots. His breathing was heavy, almost desperate, as if he was racing against time. "What's gotten into him?" Sarah asked, approaching cautiously. She'd grown more comfortable with Rex over the past week, but this behavior was unlike anything they'd seen from the normally docile animal. Tommy knelt beside Rex, trying to gently pull him away from his digging, but the dog was surprisingly strong when motivated. "Easy, boy. What are you trying to find?" It was then that Rex's paw struck something solid. The hollow sound of metal against metal rang out clearly in the evening air, causing all three of them to freeze. Rex immediately stopped digging and stepped back, his tail wagging with excitement, as he looked expectantly at Tommy. "What in the world?" Sarah breathed, kneeling beside her son to peer into the hole. Tommy reached down and brushed away the loose dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a metal box. It was old, judging by the rust around the edges, but it seemed to be intact. With some effort, he managed to work it free from the roots and soil that had held it captive. The box was about the size of a shoebox, made of tin that had once been painted green, but was now mostly brown with rust. There was no lock, just a simple latch that had corroded shut over the years. Tommy looked at his mother, who was staring at the box with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Should we open it?" he asked. Sarah's mind was racing. This was Henderson's property, or at least it had been until recently. The boundary between their land and his had never been clearly marked, and over the years, the fence line had shifted as both properties fell into various states of disrepair. But more troubling was the question of how Rex had known to dig in this exact spot. "I don't know, Tommy," she said finally. "This might belong to the Henderson estate. We should probably—" But her words trailed off as Tommy managed to work the latch free with a pocket knife. The lid creaked open, revealing contents that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Inside were papers, yellow with age but protected from the elements by the metal container. There were photographs too, black and white. Images of people Sarah didn't recognize, and what appeared to be legal documents with official-looking seals and signatures. Tommy carefully lifted out the first document, squinting at the faded writing in the dimming light. "It's some kind of deed," he said, for this property, our property." Sarah took the paper from him with trembling hands. She recognized some of the landmarks mentioned in the legal description, but the names were unfamiliar. The document was dated 1967, long before they had bought the small farm from the county in a tax sale. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, rifling through the other papers. "These are all property documents, but they're not in Henderson's name. They're in the name of someone called Robert Mitchell." Tommy looked up sharply. "Mitchell, but that's our last name." "It's a common name, honey," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was thinking about her late husband, about the stories he'd told about his grandfather, who had supposedly owned land in this area decades ago. Stories she'd always assumed were just family legends, tales that grew in the telling. Rex had been sitting patiently during this discovery, but now he stood and walked to another spot about 10 feet away, where he began sniffing the ground intently. When he looked back at them, it was clear he wanted them to follow. "I think he's trying to tell us something," Tommy said, standing up with the metal box still in his hands. "Dogs don't tell people things, Tommy," Sarah replied. But even as she said it, she was following Rex to the new location. The German shepherd began pawing at the ground again, though less frantically this time. This spot was near the old well that had been covered over years ago, a landmark that was mentioned in the property deed they'd just discovered. "Mom," Tommy said slowly, "what if Dad's stories about his grandfather were true? What if we've been living on land that actually belonged to our family?" Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. If the documents were authentic, if they proved some kind of historical ownership of this property, it could change everything. It might explain why they'd been able to buy the land so cheaply from the county, why there had been some confusion about the title, when they'd first moved here. But it also raised uncomfortable questions. If the land had belonged to Tommy's great-grandfather, what had happened to make it available for a tax sale? And more importantly, who else might know about these buried documents? As if summoned by her worried thoughts, the sound of a vehicle approaching made them all turn toward the driveway. The headlights of a pickup truck cut through the gathering darkness, and Sarah instinctively moved closer to Tommy. "Who's that?" he asked, clutching the metal box tighter. "I don't know," Sarah replied, but Rex's low growl suggested that whoever it was, the dog didn't approve of their presence. The truck pulled up to their front gate, and a man Sarah recognized from the auction climbed out. It was Earl Hutchinson, a local handyman who'd been bidding on some of the farm equipment. He was a large man with calloused hands and a beard that was more gray than black. Someone who'd lived in Millbrook his entire life and seemed to know everyone's business. "Evening, Sarah," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything." "What can I do for you, Earl?" Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice neutral, while Tommy discreetly moved the metal box behind his back. "Well, I was just thinking about that dog your boy bought at the auction," Earl said, approaching the fence but not opening the gate. "Occurred to me that old Henderson might have trained him for specific purposes, if you know what I mean. Some folks train their dogs to find things, to guard certain areas." Rex's growl grew louder, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Earl." "Oh, nothing specific," Earl said with a casual shrug that somehow didn't seem casual at all. "Just wondering if Rex there has been acting strange. Maybe digging around, showing interest in particular spots on your property." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that whatever they'd stumbled upon was about to become much more complicated than she'd imagined. Sarah maintained her composure despite the racing of her heart, meeting Earl's curious gaze with what she hoped was an expression of polite confusion. "Rex is still settling in, but he's been well behaved. Why do you ask?" Earl's smile didn't reach his eyes as he leaned against the fence post. "Oh, just curious. Henderson always said that dog had a special talent for finding things that were lost. Thought maybe he'd been demonstrating those skills for his new family." Behind Sarah, Tommy remained perfectly still, the metal box hidden behind his back. Rex had positioned himself between Earl and the family, his hackles raised and a low rumble emanating from his chest. The dog's reaction was impossible to ignore, and Sarah could see Earl taking note of it. "Well, the only thing Rex has found so far is a comfortable spot in our barn," Sarah said, forcing a laugh. "Though I appreciate you checking on him. Was there something else you needed?" Earl's expression shifted slightly, as if he was recalculating his approach. "Actually, there was. I've been thinking about what you said at the auction, about struggling to keep up with the farm repairs. I do good work for fair prices, and I've got some free time coming up. And thought maybe I could help with that barn roof, fix some of that fencing." The offer was generous, perhaps too generous. Sarah knew Earl's reputation as a skilled handyman, but she also knew his prices were usually beyond what most folks in Millbrook and could afford. The fact that he was offering his services to her, someone he barely knew, raised red flags. "That's very kind of you, Earl, but I'm not sure we can afford any major repairs right now," Sarah replied carefully. "Oh, I wasn't thinking about payment right away," Earl said, his tone becoming more persuasive. "We could work something out, maybe trade labor for something else. I'm flexible about arrangements." Rex's growling intensified, and the dog took a step forward, his injured leg barely slowing him down. Earl's eyes narrowed as he studied the German Shepherd's aggressive posture. "That's quite a guard dog you've got there," he commented. "Almost like he's protecting something valuable." The implication hung in the air, and Sarah realized that Earl suspected they'd found something on the property. But how could he know? Had he seen them from the road, or was there something else? Going on, something connected to the buried documents. Rex is protective of his new family, Sarah said firmly. It's natural for dogs to be wary of strangers, especially after what he's been through. Earl nodded slowly, but his attention kept drifting to the area where they'd been digging. The fresh earth was barely visible in the dim light, but Sarah could see him trying to make sense of what he was observing. "Well, I should be getting home," Earl said finally. "But the offer stands, Sarah. If you change your mind about those repairs, just give me a call. I think we could help each other out in ways you might not have considered." After Earl's truck disappeared down the road, Sarah and Tommy stood in silence for several minutes, both processing what had just happened. Rex remained alert, his eyes fixed on the spot where Earl's vehicle had been parked. "Mom, he knows," Tommy said quietly. "He knows we found something." Sarah nodded grimly. "The question is how he knows and what he thinks we found." They moved quickly to gather up the scattered papers and return them to the metal box. In the safety of their kitchen, under the bright fluorescent light, they spread the documents out on the table and began to examine them more carefully. The property deed was the most significant document, but there were others that told a more complete story. There were receipts for improvements made to the land, correspondence with local officials about water rights, and most intriguingly, a letter dated 1968 that mentioned a dispute over the property boundaries. "Look at this," Tommy said, pointing to a handwritten note tucked between two official documents. "It's signed by someone named Robert Mitchell, and he's talking about hiding important papers until the legal situation is resolved." Sarah read the note aloud. "If something happens to me before this matter is settled, I want my family to know that the proof of our rightful ownership is buried on the property. The dog knows where to find it. Trust the dog." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she looked at Rex, who was lying by the kitchen door, his eyes alert and watchful. "Tommy, what if your great-grandfather was this Robert Mitchell? What if he buried these documents to protect them?" Tommy's eyes widened with excitement. "And what if he trained Rex's father or grandfather to guard them? What if that's why Rex knew exactly where to dig?" It was a fantastic theory, but the pieces seemed to fit together in a way that made Sarah's rational mind struggle to find alternative explanations. The timing was right. The property matched the description in the documents, and Rex's behavior suggested knowledge that went beyond normal canine instincts. "But if that's true," Sarah said slowly, "then Earl Hutchinson might know more about this situation than he's letting on. He seemed awfully interested in Rex's digging behavior." Tommy stood up and began pacing around the kitchen, his mind working through the implications. What if Earl was working with Henderson? What if he's been looking for these documents for years? "That's possible," Sarah agreed, "but why would he care about property documents from the 1960s? The answer came to Tommy in a flash of insight. "Because if we can prove that great-grandfather owned this land legally, then maybe the county sale wasn't valid. Maybe we actually own more property than we thought, or maybe there are mineral rights or something else valuable." Sarah felt a surge of hope, mixed with fear. If the documents were authentic and legally significant, they could solve many of her financial problems, but they could also create new ones, especially if other people were interested in what they'd found. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting to see Earl's truck in her driveway or catch glimpses of him watching their property from the road. Tommy had returned to school, but he spent every free moment researching property law at the local library and asking careful questions about the history of their land. Rex, meanwhile, had undergone a remarkable transformation. The injured, dejected animal from the auction had been replaced by an alert, protective companion who seemed to sense the family's need for security. His limp was improving, and his coat was beginning to show its natural luster as Tommy's careful attention to his diet and grooming paid off. It was on a Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after the discovery of the documents, that Earl made his next move. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line when she heard the sound of a truck approaching. This time, Earl wasn't alone. A second man climbed out of the passenger seat, someone Sarah didn't recognize. He was younger than Earl, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the property. He wore clean work clothes and expensive boots, suggesting he wasn't a local laborer. "Morning, Sarah," Earl called out, his tone more formal than it had been during his previous visit. "This is my business partner, Mr. Davidson. We're here to make you an offer you might find interesting." Davidson stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you've been having some financial difficulties. I represent a company that specializes in helping rural property owners maximize the value of their land." Sarah's instincts screamed danger, but she maintained her composure. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Davidson." "Oh, we're not talking about selling," Davidson replied smoothly. "We're talking about development opportunities, mineral rights assessments, that sort of thing. Often, property owners are sitting on valuable assets without realizing it." Behind them, Rex had emerged from the barn and was approaching slowly, his posture indicating he viewed both men as threats. The dog's transformation was remarkable. He moved with purpose and authority, no longer the broken animal from the auction. "The thing is," Earl added, "developments like that require clear title to the property. Sometimes old documents surface that can complicate things, create legal challenges that are expensive to resolve." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah realized that Earl and Davidson knew about the buried documents, and they were offering to help her avoid legal complications in exchange for access to whatever valuable assets might be hidden on the property. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm satisfied with my current situation." Davidson's smile became less friendly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think you might be underestimating the complexity of your situation. Historical property disputes can be very costly to resolve, especially for someone with limited resources." It was then that Rex made his move. The German Shepherd positioned himself directly between Sarah and the two men, his lips pulled back in a silent snarl that conveyed his willingness to protect his family at any cost. "That's quite a dog," Davidson observed, but his tone suggested he was more calculating than impressed. Dogs like that can be unpredictable, especially when they're protecting something they consider valuable. The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a surge of anger that overrode her caution. "I think you gentlemen should leave now. If you have any legitimate business to discuss, you can contact me through proper legal channels." Earl and Davidson exchanged a look that suggested this conversation was far from over. As they walked back to their truck, Davidson turned for one final comment. "Think about what I said, Mrs. Mitchell. Historical property disputes have a way of becoming very complicated, very quickly. Sometimes it's better to work with people who understand the local situation." After they left, Sarah stood in her yard with Rex beside her, both of them watching until the truck disappeared completely. She realized that what had started as a simple act of kindness toward a neglected animal had somehow evolved into something much more dangerous and complex than she'd ever imagined. The following Monday brought an unexpected visitor to the Mitchell property. Sarah was preparing for her shift at the diner when she heard Rex's urgent barking from the front yard. Looking out the window, she saw a woman in a business suit stepping out of a sedan, her professional appearance a stark contrast to the rural setting. "Mrs. Mitchell," the woman called out as Sarah approached the front door. "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm an attorney with the County Land Records Office. I wonder if I could speak with you about some historical documents that may pertain to your property." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ms. Walsh." "Well, it's come to our attention that there may be some irregularities in the chain of title for this property. We're conducting a routine review of historical land records, and your property has been flagged for examination." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Sarah realized that Earl and Davidson had wasted no time in putting pressure on her through official channels. "Am I required to participate in this review?" Jennifer Walsh's smile was professional, but not particularly warm. "Not required, no. But it would be in your best interest to cooperate. If there are title issues, it's better to address them proactively rather than wait for them to become problems." Rex had positioned himself near Sarah's side, his demeanor alert but not aggressive. The dog seemed to sense that this visitor, while potentially problematic, was not an immediate physical threat. "What kind of irregularities are you referring to?" Sarah asked. "Historical ownership records primarily. Sometimes families pass down stories about property ownership that don't match the official records. If authentic documents exist that contradict the current title, it can create significant legal complications." Sarah felt trapped. If she denied knowledge of any documents, she would be lying to a county official. But if she revealed what they'd found, she might be handing over the only leverage she had in whatever game Earl and Davidson were playing. "I'd need to think about this," Sarah said finally, "and I'd probably want to consult with my own attorney before participating in any official review." Jennifer Walsh nodded as if she'd expected this response. "Of course. But I should mention that if historical documents do exist and they're not properly registered with the county, there could be penalties involved. It's generally better to come forward voluntarily." After the attorney left, Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. She called in sick to the diner, something she'd never done before, and spent the day researching property law at the library. What she learned made her stomach churn with anxiety. If the documents they'd found were authentic and legally significant, they could indeed challenge the validity of the county's tax sale. But proving their authenticity would require expert examination, court proceedings, and legal fees that she couldn't afford. Worse, if she'd unknowingly been living on property she didn't legally own, she could face eviction and financial penalties. Tommy arrived home from school to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and photocopies of property records. Rex lay beside her chair, his presence a comfort in the midst of mounting uncertainty. "Mom, what's wrong?" Tommy asked, immediately sensing the tension in the room. Sarah explained about Jennifer Walsh's visit and the research she'd been doing. Tommy listened with growing concern, his young mind trying to process the implications of their discovery. "But if the documents prove that great-grandfather owned this land, shouldn't that be good news?" Tommy asked. "It might be, eventually," Sarah replied, "but proving it could cost more money than we have, and in the meantime we could lose everything we've worked for." That evening, as they sat down to a simple dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and soup, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "Tommy, I want you to show me exactly where Rex was digging when he found that second spot." They went outside with flashlights, following Rex to the area near the old well. The dog immediately began sniffing around, his behavior indicating he remembered the location clearly. When Tommy knelt down and began carefully removing the loose soil, Rex sat back and watched patiently, as if he understood that his job was to guide them to the right places. This time, what they found was even more significant than the first discovery. Wrapped in oilcloth and buried in a waterproof container was a leather portfolio containing more detailed property records, including surveys, photographs, and most importantly, a will that clearly designated the property as belonging to Robert Mitchell and his heirs. "This changes everything," Sarah breathed, studying the documents by flashlight. "If this will is legitimate, it proves that your great-grandfather intended for this property to stay in the family." Tommy was examining the photographs, which showed the property as it had appeared in the 1960s. Many of the landmarks were still recognizable, but there were also structures that no longer existed, including what appeared to be a small cabin near the woods. "Mom, look at this," Tommy said excitedly. "There's a picture of a man with a German Shepherd. What if this is great-grandfather Robert with Rex's ancestor?" Sarah took the photograph and studied it carefully. The man bore a striking resemblance to Tommy's father, and the dog was clearly from the same bloodline as Rex. But what captured her attention was the background of the photo, which showed the exact location where they were now standing. "He's marking the spot," she realized. "The photograph is showing where the important documents are buried." As they walked back to the house, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and dread. The documents they'd found could potentially secure their ownership of the property and solve their financial problems, but they also made her family a target for people who clearly had their own agenda. The next morning brought confirmation of her fears. Earl's truck was parked at the end of their driveway when Sarah left for work, and she could see him watching the house through binoculars. When she returned home that evening, Tommy reported that strangers had been asking questions about their family at his school. "Mrs. Peterson in the office said someone called asking about you," Tommy explained. "They wanted to know how long we'd lived here and whether we'd found anything unusual on the property." Sarah realized that Earl and Davidson were escalating their pressure campaign. The visit from the county attorney had been just the beginning. Now they were trying to gather intelligence and intimidate her family through multiple channels. That night, as storm clouds gathered overhead, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She loaded the family's most important possessions into their truck, including the documents they'd discovered, and prepared to leave Millbrook. "We can't stay here, Tommy," she explained as they packed by lamplight. "These people aren't going to stop until they get what they want, and I won't put you in danger." Tommy's face showed his disappointment, but he understood the gravity of their situation. "Where will we go?" "Your Aunt Linda in Cedar Rapids has been after me to visit for years," Sarah said. "We can stay with her while I figure out what to do about the property." As they loaded Rex into the truck, the German Shepherd seemed to sense that something significant was happening. He looked back at the property with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding, as if he knew they were leaving behind something important. They drove through the night, taking back roads to avoid being followed. Sarah kept checking the rearview mirror, but the darkness behind them remained empty. Rex lay across the back seat, alert but calm, as if he trusted Sarah to keep them safe. It wasn't until they were 50 miles from Millbrook that Sarah allowed herself to believe they might have escaped without being detected. But even as relief washed over her, she knew this was only a temporary solution. Eventually, she would have to return and face whatever consequences awaited them. The documents they'd found were too important to ignore, and the property meant too much to her family's future to simply abandon. But she also realized that she couldn't handle this situation alone. She needed help, and she needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with before she made any more decisions. As dawn broke over the Iowa countryside, Sarah pulled into a rest stop to let Rex stretch his legs and to call her sister Linda. Tommy slept in the passenger seat, exhausted by the stress of the past few days, while Rex remained vigilant, watching the horizon as if he was already planning their return to Millbrook. "Linda, it's Sarah," she said when her sister answered the phone. "I need to ask you a favor, and it's going to sound strange." What followed was the most difficult conversation Sarah had ever had with her sister. Explaining about the documents, the mysterious visitors, and their midnight escape sounded like something from a movie rather than real life. But Linda listened without judgment, and when Sarah finished, her sister's response was immediate and supportive. "Come here," Linda said simply. "Stay as long as you need to. And Sarah, if those documents are real, if they prove that property belongs to your family, then you need to fight for it. Some things are worth the risk." As they drove the final miles to Cedar Rapids, Sarah felt a determination building inside her that she hadn't experienced in years. She might be running now, but she wasn't giving up. Whatever secrets were buried on that property, whatever people like Earl and Davidson were really after, she was going to find out the truth. Rex, as if sensing her resolve, lifted his head and gave a single, confident bark. The sound seemed to say that he was ready for whatever came next, and that together they would face whatever challenges awaited them. Linda Peterson lived in a modest suburban neighborhood in Cedar Rapids, where the houses were close together, and the lawns were carefully maintained. After the isolation of the farm, the sounds of traffic and neighbors felt both comforting and strange to Sarah and Tommy. Rex adapted to the new environment with remarkable ease, as if he understood that this was a temporary sanctuary. "I still can't believe you drove all night," Linda said as she poured coffee in her bright kitchen. "When you called, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown." Sarah managed a tired smile. "I'm not sure I wasn't. The whole situation feels surreal." Linda was 3 years older than Sarah, with graying hair and the practical manner of someone who'd spent her career as a high school administrator. She'd never married, dedicating her life to education and community service, which had given her connections throughout the state's legal and academic communities. "Let me see these documents," Linda said, settling down at the kitchen table with her reading glasses. Sarah spread out the papers they'd found, watching her sister's expression change as she examined each item. Linda had always been the analytical one in the family, the person who could solve puzzles and see patterns that others missed. "This is incredible," Linda murmured, studying the property deed. "If these are authentic, they completely change the history of that land. But Sarah, do you realize what this means? That we might actually own more property than we thought." That yes, but also that someone has been working very hard to keep this information buried. These documents should have been filed with the county records decades ago. The fact that they were hidden suggests that someone had a reason to want them to stay hidden. Tommy, who had been playing with Rex in the backyard, came inside and joined the conversation. "What kind of reason?" Linda looked thoughtful. "Well, if Robert Mitchell was your great-grandfather, Tommy, and he legally owned that property, then what happened to make it available for a county tax sale? How did the county acquire the legal right to sell land that belonged to your family?" It was a question that had been nagging at Sarah, but she hadn't had the resources to investigate it properly. "Is there a way to find out?" "Actually, yes," Linda said, reaching for her phone. "I have a friend who works in the state archives. She specializes in historical property records. If anyone can help us understand what happened in the 1960s, it's Margaret." The conversation with Margaret Chen was enlightening and disturbing. Linda put the call on speaker so Sarah and Tommy could hear the archivist's explanation. "This is fascinating," Margaret said after Linda described the situation. "I've seen cases like this before, where property owners died or disappeared and their land was eventually seized for unpaid taxes. But if legitimate heirs existed, the county should have made efforts to contact them before the sale." "What if the county didn't know about the heirs?" Sarah asked. "That's possible, especially if the original owner died intestate or if there were questions about the legitimacy of the will. But Mrs. Mitchell, If you've found documents that prove your husband was the rightful heir to this property, you may have grounds to challenge the county sale. After the call ended, Linda looked at her sister with a mixture of excitement and concern. Sarah, this could be huge. If you can prove that the county sale was invalid, you might be entitled to compensation for decades of illegal seizure. But it could also be expensive and complicated, Sarah replied. And I still don't understand why Earl and his friend Davidson are so interested in this. What's really on that property that makes it valuable enough to go to all this trouble? The answer began to emerge over the next few days as Linda used her network of contacts to research the history of the Millbrook area. What they discovered was that the region had been the subject of mineral rights surveys in the 1970s, shortly after Robert Mitchell's disappearance. "Look at this," Linda said, showing Sarah a geological survey report. "There are indications of significant limestone deposits on that property, the kind that would be valuable for cement production. There's also mention of potential oil and gas reserves." Tommy's eyes widened. "You mean our property might be sitting on top of valuable minerals?" "It's possible," Linda confirmed. "And if that's the case, then whoever controls the surface rights could make a fortune from mineral extraction rights." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. So Earl and Davidson aren't just interested in the land itself. They're interested in what's underneath it. Exactly. And if they've been working with the county to keep your family's legitimate claim buried, they could have been planning this for years. The implications were staggering. Sarah realized that her family hadn't just stumbled onto valuable property. They'd uncovered evidence of a decades-long conspiracy to deny them their rightful inheritance. But proving it would require more than just the documents they'd found. They needed expert testimony, legal representation, and most importantly, they needed to understand exactly what Robert Mitchell had discovered before he disappeared. It was Rex who provided the next clue. The German Shepherd had been restless since their arrival in Cedar Rapids, spending long hours staring out the window in the direction of Millbrook. On their fourth day at Linda's house, he began exhibiting the same focused behavior that had led to their discovery of the buried documents. "He's trying to tell us something," Tommy observed, watching Rex pace around Linda's backyard. "He acts like this when he knows where something is hidden." Linda, who had initially been skeptical about the dog's supposed abilities, was beginning to believe that Rex possessed knowledge that went beyond normal canine instincts. What if there are more documents buried on the property? What if Robert Mitchell created multiple caches of evidence? Sarah felt a surge of determination. "Then we need to go back and find them." "Sarah, it's too dangerous," Linda protested. "Those people know you left town. They'll be watching for you to return." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, "but they don't know about Rex's abilities. And they certainly don't know that we've figured out what they're really after." The plan they developed was risky but necessary. Linda would use her connections to arrange for legal representation and expert authentication of the documents they'd already found. Meanwhile, Sarah and Tommy would return to Millbrook, but not to their property. Instead, they would stay with Jake Morrison's family, using the cover of a social visit to allow Rex to search for additional evidence. "The Morrisons are good people," Sarah explained to Linda. "They've been neighbors for years, and Jake's father knows more about the local history than anyone. If there are more secrets buried on that property, we need to find them before Earl and Davidson do." The drive back to Millbrook was tense, but uneventful. They took a circuitous route, stopping frequently to ensure they weren't being followed. Rex seemed to sense they were returning to familiar territory, his alertness increasing as they approached the town limits. Jake Morrison's father, Bill, greeted them with the kind of hospitality that small-town Iowa was famous for. His wife, Carol, immediately set extra places at the dinner table and began preparing the guest room. "I heard you folks had some trouble with strangers asking questions," Bill said once they were settled. "That's not like Millbrook. People here mind their own business, generally speaking." Sarah decided to trust the Morrisons with at least part of the truth. "We found some old documents on our property that seem to be causing interest from people we don't know. We're trying to figure out what they mean and why they're important." Bill nodded slowly. "You know, I remember your husband talking about his grandfather once. Said the old man used to own a lot of land around here, but that the family lost it somehow. Always wondered what happened to that story." Carol brought out a photo album filled with pictures of Millbrook from decades past. "Sometimes old photographs can tell you things that official records don't," she said, settling down beside Sarah on the couch. As they flipped through the pages, Rex suddenly became alert, his attention focused on a particular photograph. It showed a group of men standing in front of what was now Sarah's property, but the landscape looked different from how she remembered it. "That's from 1967, Carol said, noticing Sarah's interest. "That was the year of the big dispute over the Henderson property line. There was some kind of legal fight about mineral rights, if I remember correctly." Tommy leaned forward to get a better look at the photograph. "Mom, look at this man in the background. Doesn't he look familiar?" Sarah studied the figure Tommy was pointing to, and her blood ran. In cold, standing at the edge of the group, partially obscured by shadows, was a man who looked remarkably like Earl Hutchinson, but 30 years younger. "Bill," Sarah said carefully, "do you know if Earl Hutchinson's family has been in Millbrook?" "For a long time?" "Oh, sure," Bill replied. "The Hutchinsons have been here for generations. Earl's father worked for the county assessor's office for years. Why do you ask?" Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with terrifying clarity. Earl's family hadn't just been in Millbrook for generations. They'd been in positions to influence property records and tax assessments. If Earl's father had been involved in the seizure of Robert Mitchell's property, then Earl's current interest in the land was deeply personal. "I think we need to get Rex back to our property tonight," Sarah said quietly. "There's something there that we need to find before anyone else does." As darkness fell over Millbrook, Sarah, Tommy and Rex prepared for what might be their most important search yet. Whatever Robert Mitchell had hidden on that property, whatever had made him disappear and his land vulnerable to seizure, they were determined to find it before Earl Hutchinson could claim it for himself. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate the familiar paths to their property, while keeping them hidden from casual observation. Rex moved with purpose through the darkness, his injured leg now barely noticeable, as he led Sarah and Tommy toward areas of the property they'd never thoroughly explored. Bill Morrison had insisted on coming with them, bringing along his old hunting rifle and a lifetime of knowledge about the local terrain. "If you're right about Earl Hutchinson," he'd said quietly, "then you're going to need backup. The Hutchinsons have had their fingers in county business for too long." They approached the property from the back, through the woods that bordered the old Henderson place. Rex immediately began showing signs of excitement, his nose working overtime as he caught scents that meant something to him, but nothing to his human companions. "He's definitely picking up on something," Tommy whispered, watching the dog's behavior. "Look how he keeps going back to that area near the creek." The creek ran along the far edge of their property, a seasonal waterway that was mostly dry this time of year. Sarah had rarely ventured into this section of the land, partly because it was overgrown with brambles, and partly because she'd been too busy trying to maintain the areas closer to the house. Rex pushed through the undergrowth with determination, occasionally stopping to look back and ensure they were following. When he finally stopped, it was at a spot where an old oak tree had fallen across the creek bed, creating a natural bridge that was now partially buried under years of accumulated debris. "What is it, boy?" Tommy asked, kneeling beside the dog. Rex began digging at the base of the fallen tree, but this time his approach was different. Instead of the frantic excavation they'd witnessed before, he was working methodically, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for and where to find it. "There," Bill said, pointing to a section of the creek bank that showed signs of artificial construction. "Someone built a retaining wall here years ago. See how the stones are fitted together?" Sarah examined the stonework by flashlight and realized that Bill was right. What appeared to be a natural creek bank was actually a carefully constructed wall, now mostly hidden by vegetation and erosion. When Rex's digging revealed a loose stone, Tommy carefully worked it free from the wall. Behind it was a cavity that had been sealed with mortar, but the mortar had cracked with age, allowing water to seep in and out over the years. Inside the cavity was another waterproof container, this one larger than the previous discoveries. When Sarah opened it, she found herself looking at documents that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's history. "My God," she breathed, reading by flashlight. "These are correspondence between Robert Mitchell and the County Assessor's Office. He was fighting the tax assessment on this property, claiming it was illegal." Tommy read over her shoulder. "Look at this letter, Mom. He's accusing someone named Harold Hutchinson of deliberately inflating the tax assessment to force him off the land." Bill's face was grim as he processed this information. Harold Hutchinson was Earl's father. He worked for the county for 40 years. But the most shocking document was at the bottom of the container, a signed affidavit from Robert Mitchell, dated just 1 week before his disappearance, stating that he had evidence of corruption in the county assessor's office and that he feared for his safety. "He knew," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "He knew they were going to force him off the land, and he was trying to gather evidence to fight them." "But why didn't he take this to the state authorities?" Tommy asked. The answer was in the final document, a letter from Robert Mitchell to his son, Tommy's grandfather. In it, he explained that he'd discovered the corruption went deeper than just the assessor's office, involving local business interests and political connections that made it dangerous to pursue legal action through normal channels. He was planning to take the evidence to federal authorities, Sarah realized, but he disappeared before he could do it. Rex had been sitting patiently during their examination of the documents, but now he stood and began moving toward another section of the creek bank. His behavior indicated there was more to find. This time, what they discovered was even more significant, a complete survey of the property that showed mineral deposits, oil reserves, and limestone formations that would be worth millions of dollars in extraction rights. "Now we know why Earl was so interested in this land," Bill said grimly. "His father must have seen these surveys in the county office and realized what the property was worth. So they inflated the tax assessment to force great-grandfather off the land," Tommy said, piecing together the conspiracy. "Then when he disappeared, they let the property go to tax sale, knowing they could buy it cheap. But they didn't count on the property being sold to someone else," Sarah added. "When we bought it from the county, we disrupted their plan." The sound of a vehicle approaching made them all freeze. Through the trees, they could see headlights moving slowly along the road that bordered their property. "We need to get this evidence to safety," Sarah whispered urgently. But Rex was already moving again, this time toward the area where their original house had stood. Sarah had always wondered why the foundation was so large for such a modest home, but now she realized that Robert Mitchell might have built additional structures that had been removed after his disappearance. The dog led them to a section of the old foundation that was partially buried under years of accumulated soil and vegetation. When Tommy began carefully excavating the area Rex indicated, they found a metal plate covering what appeared to be an underground storage area. Inside was Robert Mitchell's complete case against the county corruption, including photographs, recorded conversations, and financial records that proved Harold Hutchinson had been taking bribes from development companies in exchange for manipulating property assessments. "This is incredible," Sarah said, examining the evidence. "This proves everything. The county sale was illegal, the tax assessment was fraudulent, and the Hutchinsons have been covering it up for decades." But their celebration was short-lived. The sound of footsteps approaching through the woods made Rex growl low in his throat. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and Sarah realized they were no longer alone on the property. Well, Earl Hutchinson's voice carried clearly through the night air. "I wondered when you'd come back to finish what you started." Earl emerged from the woods with two other men, all of them carrying flashlights and looking like they'd been searching the property for some time. "You've been busy, Sarah, but I'm afraid your little treasure hunt ends here." Bill Morrison stepped forward, his rifle ready. "This is private property, Earl. You're trespassing." "Actually, Bill, I don't think it is," Earl replied with a confidence that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You see, I've been doing some research of my own. Turns out there are some serious questions about the validity of the county sale that gave the Mitchells this property." "Questions you've been manufacturing," Sarah accused. Earl's smile was cold. "Maybe, but that's not going to matter when the county sheriff arrives to investigate reports of illegal excavation and destruction of historical sites." Sarah realized that Earl had been planning this confrontation all along. He'd allowed them to find the evidence, knowing that he could use their own discoveries against them. "You see," Earl continued, "disturbing archaeological sites is a federal offense, and when the authorities discover that you've been hiding historical documents that should have been reported to the proper agencies, well, that's going to create all sorts of legal problems for you." It was a clever trap. Earl was planning to use their own evidence against them, claiming they'd been illegally excavating historical sites and hiding important documents from the authorities. "But there's a way out of this," Earl said, his tone becoming more conciliatory. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the property, enough to cover your legal expenses and set you up somewhere new. All you have to do is walk away and let me handle the historical preservation issues." Sarah looked at the documents in her hands, evidence that could expose decades of corruption and restore her family's rightful claim to the property. Then she looked at Earl's confident expression and realized that he still didn't understand what they'd really found. "Earl," she said slowly, "I think you're making a mistake." "How's that?" "You're assuming that we're the ones who are going to have legal problems, but what you don't realize is that we've found evidence that proves your father was involved in a conspiracy to defraud my family of this property." Earl's expression flickered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "That's a serious accusation, Sarah. I hope you can prove it." "As a matter of fact," Sarah said, holding up Robert Mitchell's complete case file, "I can." Rex, who had been standing quietly beside Tommy, suddenly moved forward and positioned himself between Sarah and Earl. The dog's posture was protective, but not aggressive, as if he understood that the real battle was about to be fought with words and evidence rather than physical confrontation. "These documents prove that Harold Hutchinson took bribes to manipulate tax assessments," Sarah continued. "They show that Robert Mitchell was investigating corruption in the county office when he disappeared, and they prove that the tax sale of this property was based on fraudulent assessments." Earl's companions shifted nervously, but Earl himself remained calm. Even if that were true, Sarah, it was 40 years ago. The statute of limitations has long since expired. Not for fraud, Bill Morrison interjected, and not for civil rights violations. If you can prove that the county conspired to deprive citizens of their property rights, there's no statute of limitations on that. Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into Earl's expression. He'd been so focused on preventing them from finding the evidence that he hadn't considered what would happen if they actually proved their case. Besides, Sarah added, we've already made copies of everything and sent them to the state attorney general's office. Even if you take these originals, the investigation is going to proceed. It was a bluff, but a convincing one. Earl's confident demeanor began to crumble as he realized that his carefully planned confrontation was not going according to script. You're making a mistake, Sarah, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. This property has been nothing but trouble for your family. Maybe it's time to let someone else deal with the problems. Maybe, Sarah agreed. But first, I think it's time for the truth to come out about what really happened to Robert Mitchell and why his family lost this land. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Sarah knew that their long night of searching had accomplished more than just finding evidence. They'd finally uncovered the truth about their family's history and exposed a conspiracy that had been hidden for decades. Now came the real challenge, proving their case and reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she'd confronted Earl Hutchinson, but everything had changed. The Iowa State Attorney General's investigation had moved with surprising speed, and the corrupt network couldn't withstand the scrutiny. Rex lay beside her in the morning sun, his coat now glossy and healthy, his injured leg fully healed. The transformation in the German Shepherd mirrored the transformation in their lives. Tommy came running across the yard, waving a newspaper. "Mom, look at this. They arrested the county clerk too. The article says the investigation has uncovered fraud going back 50 years. Sarah read the headline, Multi-generational corruption scheme exposed in rural Iowa County. The story detailed how Harold Hutchinson had systematically manipulated property assessments, with his son Earl continuing the scheme. The investigation revealed that Robert Mitchell hadn't vanished mysteriously. Faced with escalating threats, he'd left Millbrook to protect his family, spending his remaining years in California and never knowing that his carefully hidden evidence would eventually vindicate him. Mrs. Mitchell, Jennifer Walsh, called from the driveway, her demeanor now respectful and apologetic. "I wanted to personally deliver this," Walsh said, holding out an official document. "The county has formally recognized your family's ownership of this property, and we're prepared to offer substantial compensation." The settlement was generous beyond Sarah's hopes, clear title to their original property, an additional 100 acres, and cash compensation that would secure their future. The mineral rights. Survey confirmed limestone deposits worth enough to guarantee their family's prosperity for generations. Earl Hutchinson, faced with overwhelming evidence, had cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony exposed an entire network of corruption affecting dozens of families over the decades. "I still can't believe it's over," Sarah told Linda during their weekly phone call. "You had something they didn't count on," Linda replied. "Rex." The German Shepherd had become a local celebrity, though Sarah was careful not to oversell his abilities. The truth was remarkable enough without embellishment. Tommy had become the family historian, carefully organizing all the documents and working with the local historical society. His research revealed additional details about his great-grandfather's courage in standing up to powerful interests. I think great-grandfather knew somehow that Rex's family would still be here when we needed them, Tommy said one evening as they sat on their newly repaired front porch. Sarah smiled at her son's interpretation, but the connection between Rex and the hidden evidence was truly remarkable. With the settlement money, Sarah had repaired the house, rebuilt the barn, and implemented Robert Mitchell's original vision for sustainable farming. Rex would have his own legacy too, with puppies from a neighboring county ensuring his bloodline continued. The local community had rallied around them once the truth emerged. Bill Morrison was elected to the County Board of Supervisors, establishing new oversight procedures and transparency measures. "What you folks did changed this whole county," Bill told Sarah. "People are paying attention to local government in ways they never did before." The ripple effects continued spreading. The state launched similar investigations in other counties, and the Mitchell case became a template for exposing historical land theft. For Sarah, the most important change was personal. The constant financial pressure was gone, replaced by security and possibility she'd never experienced. She'd left her job at the diner to focus on developing the farm. Tommy had flourished, his confidence growing with his understanding of family history. His school project about local history won state recognition, and he planned to study agricultural science in college. Rex seemed content with his role as guardian of the Mitchell family legacy, no longer showing the restless behavior of his early days. His mission was accomplished, but he remained alert and protective. As autumn arrived and the first anniversary of the auction approached, Sarah reflected on the chain of events that had transformed their lives. It had started with a $10 bid from a compassionate boy and a damaged dog who refused to give up. The final piece came from a genealogy researcher who contacted them after reading about their case. Robert Mitchell had indeed made it to California, maintaining a journal throughout his years in exile, documenting his hope that someday his family would reclaim their rightful inheritance. The journal's last entry, dated weeks before Robert Mitchell's passing, contained a passage that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "I may never see Iowa again, but I have faith that the truth I buried there will someday see the light. The dogs remember what people forget." As Sarah looked out at Rex, lying contentedly in the afternoon sun, she realized her great-grandfather-in-law had been more prophetic than he could have imagined. The dog had indeed remembered, and the truth had finally seen the light. The Mitchell family's story had become more than just a tale of property rights and corruption. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important victories require patience, courage, and the willingness to trust in companions who see the world differently. Years later, when tourists visited Millbrook to see the historical markers commemorating the corruption scandal's exposure, they would ask about the German shepherd who had played such a crucial role. Sarah would smile and point to Rex's descendants playing in the yard, knowing that the legacy of loyalty and determination would continue. The $10 investment had paid dividends beyond anything Sarah could have calculated. More than financial security and legal vindication, it had given her family something precious, the knowledge that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of finding the light when the right hearts are willing to search for it. Dear listeners, we hope that Sarah, Tommy, and Rex's incredible journey has touched your hearts as much as it has ours. This remarkable story of courage, loyalty, and the triumph of truth over corruption reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come from the simplest acts of compassion. Just as Tommy's $10 bid at that country auction changed their lives forever, your support can help us continue bringing you these powerful stories of hope and determination. If this tale of buried secrets and unwavering loyalty moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button to help others discover these inspiring narratives. We've prepared a special playlist of similar heartwarming stories about families overcoming impossible odds and finding justice against all expectations. You can find it by clicking the link to your left. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories resonate with your own experiences of perseverance and faith. Every day, we bring you unique tales that explore the complexity of human relationships and the power of never giving up on what's right. Don't miss our upcoming stories of courage, mystery, and the unbreakable bonds between people and the animals who change their lives. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. And remember, sometimes the most valuable treasures are found in the most unexpected places.